The night I arrived at my son's front door with a bottle of wine and a head full of assumptions was the night I came the closest I've ever been to destroying the only family I had left. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I am not a cruel man. I have never thought of myself as someone who judges unfairly or acts without reason. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I built my career on evidence, on load calculations, on facts that didn't bend to what I wanted them to be. I believed that discipline applied not just to steel and concrete, but to the way I read people, the way I made decisions. I believed I was careful. I believed I was rational. I was wrong about almost everything. It was a Thursday evening in early November when I pulled into my son's neighborhood and parked 2 houses down. I hadn't told him I was coming. That was intentional. I wanted to see the house the way it looked when no one expected me, the curtains, the lights, whether his car was in the driveway, whether her car was. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I had been watching the edges of that marriage for 2 years, waiting for the thing I was convinced was coming. But before I could reach the front steps, the neighbor from the house directly across the street was already moving toward me. He came across his lawn with the kind of urgency that makes your stomach drop before you even know why. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who wanted to introduce himself. He said, "Are you Daniel's father?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't go in there yet, please. There are things you need to know before you walk through that door." I didn't understand. I thought something had happened to my son, an accident, a medical emergency. My chest tightened, and I started to ask, but he held up his hand and said, "Your son is fine, but you need to hear me out first." We stood there on the sidewalk for 22 minutes. By the time he was finished talking, a police cruiser had turned onto the street, and then another. They parked in front of my son's house. I watched 2 officers walk up the path I had been about to walk up, and I watched them knock on the door, and I stood there, with my bottle of wine hanging from my hand, and felt the entire architecture of my assumptions come apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to know how we got there. My son is 34 years old. He has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and a laugh that fills up a room in a way I've never been able to explain. He works in commercial real estate, has for 8 years, and he is good at it in the way that some people are simply built for a thing. When he was 26, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me he had met someone. He was nervous in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, hands moving too much, words coming out slightly too fast. Her name was Christine. She had grown up in rural Mississippi, the daughter of a mechanic and a woman who worked the early shift at a diner. She had put herself through college on loans and scholarship money and sheer determination, and she had moved north and built herself a career in social work. She was warm in the way that people are when warmth costs them something, and she loved my son in a way that was obvious from the first moment you watched them in the same room together. I should have been grateful. I should have welcomed her with everything I had. Instead, I spent 2 years being polite in the way that is worse than being rude, because at least rudeness is honest. I smiled at Thanksgiving and kept my voice even at Christmas, and found 100 small ways to let her know that I was watching, that I had reservations, that I was not yet convinced. My son noticed. He said something to me once, quietly, after a dinner where I had spent most of the evening asking questions that had edges in them. He said, "Dad, I need you to give her a real chance." I told him I was. I believed I was. The truth was simpler and uglier than that. My wife had died 14 months before my son brought Christine home, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, the kind of timeline that doesn't give you room to prepare, only to endure. My wife had been my compass for 38 years, and when she was gone, I don't have a better word for it, unmoored. I became suspicious of change. I became suspicious of anything that felt like it was pulling my son further from what remained of our family. Christine was from somewhere else. She had a family I didn't know. She had a way of making my son laugh at things I didn't understand. In my worst moments, in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning when grief has no manners, I told myself she was taking him away from me. I told myself she was not what she appeared to be. I manufactured reasons to keep my distance, and then I mistook my own manufacturing for instinct. My wife had left behind an estate that included the house, 2 investment accounts, and a trust fund she had inherited from her own parents, approximately $800,000. Conservatively managed, intended to be passed to our son upon her death. The paperwork was handled. The accounts were in order. I had power of attorney over nothing, because my wife had been thorough and organized and had structured everything so that our son would receive it cleanly, without complication. 8 months after my wife's funeral, my brother called me. My brother is 4 years younger than me, which makes him 60 now. He has always been the version of me that made different choices, charming, where I was reserved, loose with money where I was careful, perpetually between opportunities in a way that had never seemed to bother him the way it bothered me watching from the outside. We were not close in the way brothers are sometimes close, but we were family, and I loved him in the obligatory and complicated way you love someone who has disappointed you enough times that the disappointment has become part of the relationship's texture. He called me and said he was worried about my son. He said he had heard things. He wouldn't tell me who from. He said he had reason to believe that Christine was not being straight with my son about her finances, that she had debt she hadn't disclosed, that there were people he was vague on this, deliberately vague in a way I should have noticed people she owed money to. He said he thought she had married my son because of the inheritance. He said I should pay attention to the trust account. I want to tell you I questioned this. I want to tell you the engineer in me demanded sources and documentation. But I had been awake at 2 a.m. for 8 months by then, turning over the same grief like a stone you can't stop picking up, and my brother handed me a narrative that fit the shape of my fear so perfectly that I accepted it without asking him to prove a single word. I started watching. I started keeping notes, dates, amounts, questions I couldn't answer. I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective who worked out of a small office downtown and charged $400 a day. I told myself I was protecting my son. I told myself that's what fathers do. For 6 months, the investigator found nothing. Christine paid her bills on time. She had no hidden debt. Her background was exactly what she had told my son it was. There was no secret past, no unexplained income, no evidence of anything, except a woman who was exactly who she claimed to be. I should have stopped there. I should have called my brother back and said, "You were wrong," and then called my son and apologized for the months of cool dinners and pointed questions. Instead, I told myself the investigator hadn't looked hard enough. I told myself absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. I found a second investigator. It was the second investigator who found something. He came to my house on a Wednesday afternoon, sat at my kitchen table, and spread out documents I hadn't asked for and didn't expect. There were wire transfers, not large, nothing dramatic, but consistent, money moving out of a holding account connected to my son's real estate business. Small enough not to trigger automatic flags. Regular enough to be intentional. The account connected to the transfers was not Christine's. It was my brother's. I sat at that table for a long time after the investigator left. I sat there and tried to find another explanation. The way you search a room for a lost set of keys, even after you've already found them somewhere embarrassing. I went through every possibility. I called up 14 months of phone calls with my brother. All the conversations about Christine. The warnings he had given me. The vagueness that I had never pushed him to clarify. He had been stealing from my son's business. Small amounts, steady, for at least 11 months. And he had spent those same 11 months making sure my eyes were pointed at Christine instead of at him. I didn't call my brother. I didn't call my son. I sat with it for 2 days and felt something I can only describe as a particular kind of shame. The kind that doesn't arrive all at once but builds up in layers. Each layer, a memory you're now forced to reread. Every cold dinner, every pointed question. Every moment Christine had tried to meet me halfway, and I had moved the halfway point further away. On the 3rd day, I got in my car and drove to my son's house. I don't know exactly what I intended to do. Tell my son. Apologize to Christine. Both of those things, in some order. I brought the wine because I thought maybe the gesture of it would say something I didn't have the right words for yet. I parked 2 houses down out of an old habit that already felt wrong. And then the neighbor came across the street. His name was Terry. He had lived across from my son and Christine for 3 years. He knew them the way neighbors know each other in a suburb where people actually pay attention. Morning waves, borrowed tools, conversations over the fence in the summer about nothing and everything. He knew Christine had been trying to reach me. He knew because she had told him, on more than one occasion, standing in his driveway with her arms crossed against the cold, that she had been trying to tell my son's father what she had discovered and that she didn't know how to make me listen. She had figured it out 4 months before I did. She had found the first discrepancy in my son's accounts, almost by accident, looking for a receipt for a business expense he needed for taxes. She had followed it carefully, the way someone follows a crack in a wall to find out where it starts. She had documented it. She had sat down with my son and walked him through everything she had found, and my son had confronted his uncle, and that confrontation had happened 3 weeks before the night I showed up with a bottle of wine and a stomach full of too late understanding. My brother had denied everything initially. He had wept. He had called it a misunderstanding, a loan he had intended to repay, a complicated arrangement that had gotten away from him. My son had given him 1 week to return what he had taken and disappear from their lives quietly. He had taken that week to do something worse. He had gone to a lawyer not to return the money, but to construct a counter-narrative. He had filed a civil claim alleging that my son's business had engaged in financial impropriety, using fabricated documents he had apparently been building for months as a contingency. It was a scorched earth move, the kind that doesn't need to win to do damage. My son had spent 2 weeks navigating this, keeping it from me because he thought I might do something rash, keeping it from most people because it was humiliating and frightening, and not yet resolved. The police cars that pulled up while I stood on the sidewalk with Terry were not there because of my brother's civil claim. They were there because of what had happened that afternoon. My brother had come to the house. My son had not been home. Christine had been there alone. And my brother had come to the front door and told her that if she pushed forward with reporting the wire transfers to the district attorney, something she had been preparing to do, he would make sure I believed things about, per her, that would end her marriage. He said he had information. He said he had photographs. He said I was already primed to believe the worst of her, and all he had to do was make one phone call. Christine had recorded the entire conversation on her phone. The moment my brother left, she called the police. Terry had watched my brother leave. He had seen me pull up 20 minutes later and recognized me from photographs my son kept in the house. He had crossed the street because he was not going to let me walk through that door in ignorance and make the situation worse than it already was. When the police knocked, Christine opened the door. She had the recording ready. She had the financial documents ready. She had everything organized in a folder she had apparently prepared weeks earlier. Because Christine is the kind of person who does not wait for things to resolve themselves when she can resolve them. I learned all of this standing on the sidewalk with Terry. The cold working its way through my jacket, the wine bottle becoming heavier with each passing minute. Terry was a careful talker, measured, thorough. The kind of man who understood that information delivered out of order does more harm than good. He took me through it step by step. He told me what Christine had found, what my son had done, what my brother had attempted, what had happened that afternoon. He told me, gently but without softening it, that Christine had been aware of my suspicions for a long time and had spent considerable energy trying to find a way to reach me before things deteriorated further. I asked Terry how she knew I suspected her. He looked at me for a moment before answering. He said, "She said your son told her, and she said she understood it because she knew what you'd been through losing your wife, and she knew she was the stranger in the room. She said she never blamed you for it. She just wanted a chance to prove you wrong." I had to look away after that. I looked at my son's house, the trim painted the color his mother would have chosen, the porch light already on, even though it wasn't fully dark yet, the small things that accumulate into a life, and I understood for the first time with real clarity what I had been doing for 2 years. Not protecting my son, protecting myself, protecting the version of my grief that required a villain, that required the change in my son's life to come with a price, that needed someone to blame for the fact that everything was different now and would never go back. I had handed my brother a loaded gun and pointed it at my own family. One of the officers came back down the front path and asked if I was George Marsden. I said yes. He said my son was inside and was asking for me. He said I could come in. I left the wine on Terry's porch because it seemed wrong to bring it in, and I walked up the path and through the door, and my son was standing in the living room looking like he hadn't slept properly in weeks, and Christine was sitting at the kitchen table with a police officer going through her folder of documents, and for a moment no one said anything. My son looked at me and said, "How much did Terry tell you?" I said, "Enough." He nodded. He looked like he was trying to decide which of the several things he needed to say should come first. I saved him the effort. I said, "I owe your wife an apology that I don't have good enough words for, and I owe you one too. And I need you to know that none of what I did was about her. Not really. It was about me. It was about me being afraid and being foolish and listening to someone I should have questioned a long time ago." My son was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, Dad." He said it without anger, which was harder to absorb than anger would have been. Christine looked up from the table. She looked tired in a way that went beyond the day, the kind of tired that comes from months of carrying something heavy without being able to put it down. She looked at me and she said, "I'm glad you're here. Not, it's fine. Not, don't worry about it. Just, I'm glad you're here." The simplest possible mercy. I sat down at that kitchen table while the officers finished taking Christine's statement and going through her documentation. The financial records were thorough, 11 months of transfers, totaling $63,000, with timestamps and account records, and a chain of evidence that the investigating officer later told my son was unusually well organized for a civilian complaint. Christine had cross-referenced everything against my son's legitimate business accounts, had written a clear summary of her methodology, had even included a timeline of the confrontation with my brother and the subsequent legal maneuver he had attempted. The officer said, "You put this together yourself?" Christine said yes. He said, "What do you do for work?" She said she was a social worker. He said, "Huh." And then he said, "This is better than most of what I get from accountants." My brother was arrested 2 days later. The charges included wire fraud, extortion, and criminal threatening. He had, in the months since my son confronted him, moved money through 2 additional accounts in an attempt to obscure the original transfers, which added obstruction to the list. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty, which surprised no one. The civil claim he had filed was subsequently dismissed when it became clear the supporting documents had been fabricated, a fact established within 10 days by a forensic accountant the DA's office retained. He did not contact me. I did not contact him. I don't know yet what shape that silence will eventually take, whether it becomes permanent or whether it eventually transforms into something else. What I know is that every warning he gave me about Christine, every careful, vague, well-timed word was a tool. Not concern, not love, not brotherhood. A tool, deployed to keep my attention in the wrong direction for as long as he needed. I have thought about this more than I can adequately describe. I have tried to understand how a person arrives at that choice, how you look at your brother's grief, your nephew's happiness, your family, and decide that the leverage those things provide is more valuable than the things themselves. I don't have an answer that satisfies me. I'm not sure one exists. What I have instead is a kitchen table. In the weeks after the arrest, I started coming to my son's house on Sunday mornings. Not announced, but not unannounced in the way I used to come. I would call ahead, ask if Sunday worked, arrive with grocery bags instead of suspicion. Christine made coffee in the particular way she had strong, with a small amount of cardamom that I had noted privately the first time as foreign and had come to think of, by the 3rd or 4th Sunday, as the smell of that kitchen on a morning when everything was temporarily okay. We talked. Real talking, not the careful performance of talking I had been engaging in for 2 years. She told me about growing up in Mississippi, about her father's shop where she used to do homework on a workbench, about putting herself through school in a way that wasn't heroic in her telling but matter of fact, the way people talk about difficult things that are simply part of how their life went. I told her about my wife. I had not been able to talk about my wife to very many people without the grief making the conversation too dense to navigate. But Christine listened in a way that made it navigable. She asked questions that showed she was actually curious, not just being polite. One Sunday in January, she showed me a photograph she kept on the bookshelf. Not a wedding photo, but a candid picture someone had taken of her and my son at some outdoor event, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, neither of them aware of the camera. My son looked the way he had looked when he was 12 years old, and something had made him genuinely happy, open in a way that kids are before they learn to manage their expressions. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I said, "He's happy." She said, "He is." And then she said, "We both are, especially now." The now meaning, I understood the absence of the weight they had been carrying. The financial threat resolved. The legal situation moving through its process. And perhaps, at least partly, my presence at the table not as an inspector, but as a father, which is what I should have been from the beginning. The civil proceedings around my brother moved slowly, the way legal matters always do when there are multiple charges and a defendant who is contesting everything. My son retained a separate attorney to pursue recovery of the $63,000 through civil court, parallel to the criminal case. Christine continued working with the DA's office when documentation was needed. She was methodical and unsentimental about it, in a way I came to recognize as one of her genuine qualities. She didn't enjoy the process, but she wasn't going to step back from it either. She had protected her family, and she was going to see it through. I testified in the preliminary hearing. I told the court about the phone calls from my brother, the things he had told me about Christine, the way he had directed my attention. I told it plainly and completely, including the parts that made me look like a fool. An attorney asked me, not unkindly, why I had believed my brother's account without seeking to verify it. I said that I was grieving, and that grief had made me susceptible to a narrative that fit my fear. The attorney didn't push further on that. The record reflects it. Walking out of that courthouse with my son beside me, I felt something I had not felt since before my wife got sick. Not happiness exactly, but a specific quality of being present, of being in the right place, doing the right thing for the right reason. My son put his hand on my shoulder briefly as we went down the steps. The way men in my generation sometimes communicate the things we haven't learned to say directly. I understood what he meant. There is something I want to be honest about, because this story is not one where the lesson arrives cleanly and the person who needed to learn it is fully reformed and everything is simple. The truth is that I still catch myself, sometimes, in the reflex of suspicion. I still sometimes feel the old pull toward the worst interpretation of an ambiguous thing. Grief does not rewire a person neatly, and neither does the discovery that you were wrong. What I have instead of a clean transformation is awareness, the ability to notice the reflex now, to question it before it drives a decision, to ask myself whose voice I'm actually listening to when I hear the whisper that says, "Be careful, something is wrong here." Most of the time, when I ask that question honestly, the answer is, nothing is wrong. The voice is mine, carrying old weight. Terry, the neighbor, came to dinner at my son's house one evening in February. His wife came too, a cheerful and direct woman who worked in hospital administration and had clearly heard a version of this entire story from Terry's side. She said to me at some point during the meal, with the frankness of someone who has decided she likes you and sees no reason to be indirect about it, "Terry said you looked like a man who'd just been told his whole house was built wrong." I said that was accurate. She said, "Well, at least you found out before it fell down." My wife would have liked her. My wife would have liked Christine too. She would have seen immediately what I was too frightened to see, that this woman sitting across the table at Sunday dinners, who remembered how I took my coffee after one visit and asked genuinely interested questions about bridge engineering, and drove my son to the doctor when he had the flu, and documented financial crimes with the thoroughness of a 25 to a fay, professional because it was her family on the line, was exactly the kind of person worth building something with. My wife had been that kind of person. She would have recognized it. I think about that sometimes. I think about the 2 years of dinners my wife never got to have with Christine, because my wife died before they could meet, and because I spent the time after that being afraid instead of being open. I think about what those dinners would have looked like, what they would have talked about, I try not to stay too long in that particular regret, because regret is a room you can live in if you're not careful, and I spend enough time in rooms I shouldn't have. What I do instead is show up on Sunday mornings. I carry grocery bags and I drink coffee with cardamom, and I sit at a kitchen table with my son and his wife and I listen. When there is something to say, I say it. When there is nothing to say, I stay anyway. Because presence is sometimes the only thing you have to offer, and it turns out that's often enough. The grandfather clock my wife picked out at an estate sale in 1987 stands in the hallway of my house, and when I come home on Sunday evenings, it marks the hour in the empty room, and I stand there for a moment and let myself feel the weight of that emptiness. And then I go to the kitchen and make dinner and think about next Sunday. I am not a man who was cruel. I was a man who was afraid, which is a different thing, though not by as much as I would like. I was a man who handed his fear to the wrong person and let it be used against the people he loved most. I was a man who needed a stranger to cross a street and stop him before he walked through a door he wasn't ready to walk through. I am grateful Terry was watching. I am grateful Christine recorded that conversation. I am grateful my son said, "I know, Dad," without anger, because I did not deserve the grace of that and he gave it to me anyway. If you are watching this and you recognize something in it, the way suspicion can feel like wisdom, the way grief can make the wrong voice sound like the right one, the way we sometimes look at the person standing in front of us and refuse to see them clearly, because seeing them clearly would require us to change, then I hope you don't need a stranger to stop you on the sidewalk. I hope you can do it yourself, now, before the police cars come. But if you do need the stranger, I hope you have one, and I hope you listen.